thinking, as many people still do, they think about issues. They're like, oh, the government should do this, the government should do that. I'm like, well, the government of Mars should do this and it should do that. And, it's probably fucked up in a lot of ways because this planet is totally barren. But I don't seem to have any power over the government of Mars. Wow, do you have any power over the government of Washington? No? Well, maybe you shouldn't be thinking about what it should do because you seem to be acting like a guy on a desert island deciding what kind of steak to order, And this is not your, yeah, I think pornography is basically also a good, analogy here. When you ask yourself what Washington should do or how it should be governed and you have no power, you're basically an incel looking at porn. And you're being stimulated by this feeling of being important and mattering. You're not important. You don't matter. If you decide that you do want to be important and you do want to matter, your first question is not, oh, what should I do when I'm king? The question of how you actually become king is a much, much more relevant question. And so just by sort of assuming, it's like, here's a concrete example of this. People still care about elections in this country. I'm like, man, my father worked in the State Department. My mother worked in the Department of Energy. My stepfather was on the Hill. I'm like, I'll tell you how the State Department thinks about elections. Imagine you're a fish in a coral reef, and one day there's a storm, a big storm, and you're like, I keep moving back and forth a little bit, really uncomfortable, hard to get the algae out of the rocks, but you're not up there in the fucking waves, and the waves are not crashing on the coral, right? You're just like, oh, everything's a little shaky today. And the level, if you look at the level of power, and I think a lot of people sort of intuitively realize this, but, one simple way of quantifying it is you say, okay, how much, if I wanted to give the president who elected Americans complete control over the executive branch, how much would I increase his power by in orders of magnitude? Would that be 1 order of magnitude, 2 orders of magnitude, 3, or 4? I think it's somewhere between 3 and 4, right? So one way to make this very, very, one analogy that makes this point clear is that it's actually very, very common in political history for institutions which are formerly powerful to become essentially ritual. So if you look at the Emperor of Japan and the Queen of England, they've both done, gone through the same process. Actually, the Emperor of Japan has been fake for, I believe, over 1,000 years. He's not even the real authority in the Meiji Restoration. If you look at, let's say for the sake of argument, that Queen Elizabeth is actually the ruling Queen of England, Elizabeth I. Elizabeth II, let's say for the sake of argument, although, if you say this to Brits, it's amazing. They'll push back on you so hard when you say that Queen Elizabeth II doesn't matter. To Americans, it's completely obvious that this is this vestigial organ that's completely irrelevant to the way the country is governed. Even Parliament is a vestigial organ, but the Queen is like a vestigial organ squared. So if you want to evaluate the reality of a political figure, you can say, well, is this more like Elizabeth I or more like Elizabeth II? Well, I can tell you that anytime someone goes into Donald Trump's office to meet him, there's a cameraman there and they take a photo together. Now, if you're the CEO of Apple, do you spend a quarter of your day in photo ops? I don't think so. So that answers your question right there, right? And so you basically, when you care about these elections, you're participating in this essentially ceremonial process. It's not completely ceremonial. It hasn't gone all the way to Elizabeth II, but it's clearly not Elizabeth I. And so if you basically take that as a ratio, you say, okay, here, I'm going down to the polling booth. I'm going to elect, I and the other, 60 million Americans who vote, 120 or whatever it is. I think it's like 120. I and these other Americans are going to choose the head of the executive branch as defined in the Constitution. Okay, what percentage of absolute control over that executive branch does that figure have? Oh, I see, it's about 0.1%. He can push it around in various ways. He can certainly disrupt its functioning. But basically, you're not participating in a 100% election. You're participating in an 0.1% election. So forget about your voting machines being hacked. You got hacked a long time ago, buddy. And so, in a way, you're basically like, when you start to ask, really stupid, obvious questions like this, and you're like, is that related to the thing where they say democracy is good, but politics is bad? And I'm like, you already got Animal Farm, man. Your grandparents got Animal Farm. And, there's this great book by, published by the Mises Institute, actually, this great American journalist with a really weird name, Garrett Garrett. The first Garrett has only one R. The second Garrett has two R's, and two T's. And the first one only has one T. And great. He was a mainstream financial journalist, followed the very typical 20s, 30s path of being a liberal who becomes a libertarian and then a right winger. He wrote a wonderful book, which I believe you can get on the Mises Institute, website, called The Revolution Was. And he wrote this in the 40s, and his message was to all these right wingers who were at the time and have always been saying at the time, until this time, our republic is about to be overthrown. We're on the cusp of, we're going to win it. We could lose it right here, but your check is going to turn the tide, so, get out your pen right now. And it's like this whole fundraising pitch of we're going to turn the tide. And Garrett Garrett is like, look, the tide already came in. The Republic of the 1920s is no more. It does not exist. What we have is basically two phases of the FDR Republic. We have the monarchy when FDR was alive, and we have the oligarchical bureaucracy after he died. That's our regime. The shit from the 18th century is just like matters as much as like the goddess Amaterasu giving the magic sword to the first emperor of Japan. If you could bring any of the founders back and had them look at this present system, they would be like, man, I have no idea what the fuck this is, but like, it doesn't have shit to do with whatever we were doing, and they would be like, it's done.